Welcome back to Zane Customs. In this week's episode, I'm going to be sculpting another custom D&D figure. So, like all my other custom D&D figures, it first started off with the drawing, which is what you're seeing here. And I eventually went into an app called Forger to sculpt it out, which is what you're seeing here. And unfortunately, this is way before my time of recording and doing YouTube, so I don't have any video of me sculpting this, but this is where the whole sculpt's going to start off with this original sculpt I did in Forger about a year ago. And I'm just going to mention this because I know you guys might be recognizing this character and be wondering why he looks like this, but he is based off Godzilla. That is basically Godzilla's head. But basically what happened is my buddy that plays this character, he loves Godzilla and like all the Godzilla movies. He loves everything about Godzilla. So when we were creating this D&D campaign, I basically told everybody, create whatever character you want, and you know I'll make it work. And he loves Godzilla, so he came up with this. Now this character isn't literally a Godzilla human hybrid thing. This is actually armor he wears. But just so you know, that's why he looks like Godzilla. And this was actually the third sculpt I had ever worked on. So at this point, I wouldn't say I was getting good, but I was getting a lot better. So like, I feel like with my Lion Man, the anatomy was getting a lot better. And then this sculpt is when I feel like I really tried hard with the cloth work and the clothing in general. It's not perfect, but I basically wanted it to look like he had all these robes and they were just kind of flowing in the wind. And again, yeah, it's not perfect, but up to this point, this is the best I'd ever done, and I was really proud of how it turned out. So something you'll see me doing here, and you'll see me doing a lot, is a new technique I just recently learned about. I know it's pretty common, I'm pretty sure, but I just recently learned about it, and it's called noise filtering. But basically, you could apply a texture to your noise filter and it'll apply that texture evenly over the whole mesh. And if you have the right type of alpha, then you know it won't have any weird seams or any breaks or anything like that. And it's just really nice for getting a consistent fabric texture across the whole mesh, which you'll see here in a bit. I'll start doing some texturing on this helmet, and sometimes you don't want it to be perfectly even, sometimes you want it to look more organic, and you know, I'll end up doing that with this texture, or with this helmet here. Right there, see how I just kind of drag in like rock textures? You can do that with fabric textures, but the problem is it's fabric, and you know, if you drag in one texture and then drag in the next one and it's a little bit smaller and they don't perfectly line up, it's going to look weird. It's not going to look like real fabric. So that's where the noise filtering really helps out and makes everything look a lot better. So one thing I'm going to mention that I mentioned in my previous video is that me and my buddies started this campaign over a year ago, way before I ever did any of these drawings, or way before I even got into sculpting or anything. And the main reason we never finished it is due to procrastination on my part, but also just things came up, and you know, we got girlfriends or got married or whatever, so we don't have time really. But it's one thing that we do want to finish in the future, so I'm not going to go into too much detail on these characters because I don't want to spoil it. But that's why I don't go too in detail about these characters. Like, for example, his helmet, it's not metal, it's carved out of a certain material, and you know, I'm not going to go into too much detail. But okay, here's what I was talking about with the noise filtering again. See how it has a pretty much perfect fabric texture go over the whole his whole robe, the whole mesh, and you don't have weird breakups, which on his helmet, when I'm given the rock or the rough textures, it doesn't really matter because it's more organic, and that's kind of what I'm going for. But with fabric texturing, especially just because you don't have fabric that just has random threads going here and there, you know, it's all planned out. It's almost like a grid, you know, it needs to look perfect and they all need to line up well. So when you don't do that, then it looks weird. So what I'm doing here is basically masking off what I don't want to get this fabric texture, and so all the lighter gray is going to get textured, and then I'm going to inverse it and give what was a lighter gray or was the darker gray and is now the lighter gray, I'm going to give it a separate texture. And another thing that I might have mentioned this in one of my other videos, I can't remember, but these sculpts were a pretty big struggle. Well, they originally were, obviously, because they were the first things I ever sculpted, so I just had to struggle just how to learn to do it in general. But taking them and redoing them was a bit of a struggle because some of them had really messed up geometry. The farther I get into them, they weren't as bad just because I knew more, but like my first one had really weird geometry. And then like even story-wise, this is the very beginning of the D&D campaign, and their clothing and everything is pretty basic. Like my last week's video is a lion man, and all he was wearing was a loincloth because he's from a pretty primal tribe and they don't really have much, so all he had was a loincloth, and that was, you know, something that we decided on character-wise. But going to sculpt him, a loincloth's pretty boring, you know, so I had to rely on his anatomy and the fur to make it interesting, which worked out because again, like I've mentioned in a lot of my videos, I love superheroes and comic books and stuff, so probably my best, or probably what I'm best at is sculpting big muscly dudes, so that worked out well. But coming to this dude, I was really happy with the way his robes flowed and everything, so I didn't necessarily feel like I needed to change any of that. I did change a few things proportionally, but you don't really notice it. But other than that, it all pretty much looks the same, so all I wanted to do was really add texture and make it look better that way. But even doing that, it was still pretty simple. So what I decided on is basically have some underrobes that, or like wrappings that go across his body that have been ripped and torn up, and that's what I'm doing here. On his chest, I want it to look like he has all these wrappings that kind of weave in and out, and then his clothing's really old and tattered, so they're kind of ripped up. And that's something that, for one, fits with the character, which is the most important. You know, I don't want to do something for the sculpt that just looks cool, and then like when we're actually playing the campaign, I'm like, oh, that's not real, you know. So it actually fits with the character, and then I think it looks cool having all the different ribbons, or I don't know what you call them, kind of weaves coming in and out of his clothing and blowing in the wind. And then I added all these little, I started with just a cylinder, and then I warped it and made it look like it was flowing too, and added those to the end to make it look like tattered fabric that was all torn up and ripped, and you can see all the strings coming out the end. And I don't know how I feel about this. I'll probably go and change it eventually. I think it looks good when you zoom out and just look at the character as a whole, but zoomed in, it looks really weird. So like as far as like 3D printing this character, I don't know how that would turn out. It would definitely be a really fragile part. The 3D printer could definitely do it, but I'm not sure how or what I'm going to do with it. And what I'm doing here is adding in a base, and this character is from the mountains, so I'm just trying to make it look like a snowy base. Which, another thing that I thought about adding to this character was some fur, like a fur cloak or something, but again, that doesn't really fit with the character. Like I don't want to get into it because obviously, like I said earlier, I don't want to spoil things for my D&D players that might be watching these videos, but there's reasons that they don't have fur and stuff up there, so I decided against that. And I did want to spice up his underclothing a little bit, because he's basically like not necessarily like a priest, but these are like ceremonial clothing that have been passed down for generations, and even though, and that's kind of why it's all tattered and stuff, because they're something that's been part of his race and his culture for, you know, decades. And so it's a little bit more fancy. They added color into it and things because, again, it's a more important clothing item. And this is one thing I had a lot of trouble with. For whatever reason, when I'd go to add the seam, this white seam along the edge of these little tattered pieces, it's almost like the color would bleed out into the rest of the mesh. I don't know why. And it wasn't a big deal. I just didn't add the seam on those because, again, it kind of works. You know, it's tattered clothing, so you don't really notice it too much. But that was kind of a weird thing I had to deal with. And now I'm going to move on to his arms. So with this whole sculpt, I was pretty happy with the way everything looked. So really all I had to do was add a good texture, fix a few things here and there that weren't anatomically correct, but like with his head and his gauntlets here, I was mainly just fleshing out details because, well, for one, I've mentioned this a lot, but Forger doesn't have the capability ZBrush does. It's just not as powerful. You can't do as much, so you can't get as much detail. For two, I don't know what the deal is, but in Forger I could be sculpting something and adding a lot of detail in, and it looks good. And then when I bring it over to ZBrush, that detail's not really there. It's a lot shallower than it looks in Forger, which is another problem I have with ZBrush. Going from ZBrush to 3D printing, sometimes that detail's not as defined as it looks in the computer. I think it's just different programs and things, you know, and then coming to real life, you just have to kind of find a good balance. But so that's another thing. I was just fixing up stuff and adding detail. And here what I'm doing, this is when I created the D&D campaign, I basically told all my players, create any character you want, any race, anything, and I'll make it work. And then everybody gets one item, whether that could be a weapon, a magical item, anything, and I'll tie that into the story and into their backstory and all these things. So this guy's was a staff, a magical staff that basically grants him fire powers. And you'll seen in the picture I posted at the beginning of the video, the drawing I did, I kind of wanted the staff because his magic is fire. I thought it'd be cool to have this staff be like a bright stainless steel or something. But if any of you have ever worked with metal, you know if you get it hot enough, it'll start to temper, which is basically it'll start to turn colors. So if you get it hot enough, it'll go to kind of a light brown to like a light yellow to a golden straw. Then it'll start to turn to blue and purple, and you could get some really crazy colors. So I thought it'd be cool to have it, the closer it got to the top of the orb, which, you know, kind of in my imaginations would be the hot part of it. The closer it got to that part, the hotter it was. So you can kind of see I'm going back and forth from the original picture, but I want it to have that temper that I was talking about. And I'm not sure how I feel about it. I think the coloring is okay. I couldn't get exactly the shades of colors I wanted, but I was painting this on top of a metal shader, or it's a gel shader, but it looks metal. So when you do that on top of a shader, then it makes it look like a blue metal or a red metal or whatever shader you're using, which is what I wanted. But also, I think the yellow looks a little off. And then other than that, I'm not sure how I feel about the shape of the staff. I think the original drawing had it was a simpler and a cooler design, so I might go back in later and edit that out and put in the original staff. But that's pretty much the whole sculpt here. I'm just rendering out some pictures, but I'm pretty happy with the way everything turned out, and I'm going to throw up some pictures here so you guys can get a better look at it. So I'm about done with these D&D characters. I just got basically 2 weeks left, and then I'll get back into Minecraft and superhero stuff. I know a lot of you guys have been asking me about that in the comments, so I'll get back to that pretty soon. But I just want to mention you can also check out my Instagram or my Etsy. I usually post some progress photos on Instagram, so if you're interested in that, and if you want to buy any of these sculpts, you can check out Etsy. And also I want to mention that I really appreciate if anyone's willing to like, comment, subscribe, anything like that. I super appreciate it. That I do a new video every Monday, so check back in next week to see my next video, and thank you so much for watching.